Nobody taught you how to learn, they taught you what to learn. There is a massive difference between those two things, and that difference is the reason most people spend years trying to get good at something that someone else figured out in months. Josh Waitzkin knows this better than almost anyone alive. He became a chess prodigy, winning multiple national chess championships as a child, and then walked away from chess entirely and became a world champion in Tai Chi push hands. A completely different discipline requiring completely different skills, and the question everyone asked him was the same. How? How does a person become world-class at one thing and then start over in something entirely different and reach world-class there too in a fraction of the time it takes most people to become merely competent? His answer, laid out in his book The Art of Learning, is not what most people expect. It is not about talent. It is not about logging more hours than everyone else. It is not about some genetic gift that makes information stick better or patterns emerge faster. It is about understanding something that neither chess nor Tai Chi nor any other subject ever explicitly taught him. How to actually learn, not what to learn. How? Because school gave you subjects. It gave you textbooks and deadlines and the pressure of tests that measured memorization rather than genuine understanding. It gave you the experience of being graded on how well you could hold information long enough to reproduce it and then let it go to make room for the next batch. But it never gave you the actual skill of learning itself. The ability to take something completely new and break it down and absorb it and apply it and genuinely own it in a fraction of the time most people think is required. That skill exists. It is learnable. And the people who have it are not smarter than you. They do not have more hours in their day. They are not operating on some different level of intelligence or motivation or natural ability. They simply understand something about how the human brain actually acquires new capability that most people have never been taught and never went looking for. Because the education system was not designed to produce fast learners. It was designed to produce students who could receive and reproduce information on demand. And those are completely different things. Being taught is passive. Learning is active. Being taught is receiving. Learning is constructing. And the construction of genuine, lasting capability in any area happens through a specific set of principles that the fastest learners in the world understand and apply, and that most people have never encountered in any organized form. Until now, 7 principles. Each one backed by what we understand about how the brain actually builds new neural pathways and genuine lasting skill. Each one applicable immediately to anything you are currently trying to learn or anything you want to start learning, and together they represent a completely different relationship with learning that will change how fast you acquire new capability for the rest of your life. Before we begin, type this in the comments and mean it. I learn fast. I apply faster. 1. Stop consuming. Start constructing. The brain learns by doing, not by watching. Josh Waitzkin describes a concept in The Art of Learning that he calls making smaller circles. The idea is that genuine mastery does not come from learning more things. It comes from going deeper into fewer things. From taking the fundamental movements and principles of a skill and investing in them so completely, practicing them so thoroughly at the micro level that they become automatic and deeply embodied rather than consciously executed. And the only way to make those circles smaller, to go that deep into the fundamentals, is through actual doing, not through watching someone else do it, not through reading about doing it, through the specific and irreplaceable experience of attempting it yourself and encountering the specific friction of your own current limitations. Most people get this completely backwards. They consume far more than they construct. They watch more tutorials than they attempt. They read more about the skill than they practice the skill. They accumulate more information about how to do the thing than actual attempts at doing the thing. and they wonder why the watching and the reading is not producing the capability that only the doing can produce. The brain does not build new pathways by receiving information about something. It builds new pathways by attempting something, by engaging with the material not as a passive receiver but as an active constructor of understanding through direct experience with the actual task. This is not a motivational concept. It is a neurological reality. When you watch someone else perform a skill, certain neurons fire in observation. When you attempt the skill yourself, a completely different and far more extensive network of neurons fires in actual engagement. And the neural pathways built through actual engagement are the ones that produce genuine capability. The ones built through observation produce the feeling of understanding, which is not the same thing. The feeling of understanding is the reason most people think they are learning when they are actually just consuming. You have experienced this yourself. The video that explained something so clearly that you felt you understood it completely. And then the moment you tried to do it yourself, the understanding evaporated and you were left holding nothing but the memory of someone else doing it well. Because the feeling of understanding and the actual capability to do something are built through completely different processes. The feeling comes from consuming well-explained content. The capability comes from attempting the thing and encountering the specific friction of your own current limitations. That friction is not failure. That friction is the learning. Waitskin describes his own learning process as one of constant investment in the fundamentals through actual practice rather than through intellectual understanding of the fundamentals. He writes about spending hours on single chess positions, not to understand them conceptually, but to feel them intuitively through direct and sustained engagement with the material. The difference between intellectual understanding and intuitive embodiment is built entirely through doing, and the person who understands this shifts the ratio of their time dramatically. Less watching, more attempting, less consuming, more constructing, less preparation for the doing, more doing. The great Stoic philosopher Seneca understood this principle 2,000 years before anyone was measuring neural pathways. He wrote, "While we are postponing, life speeds by. Not while we are watching, while we are postponing the actual doing. Whatever you are currently trying to learn, reduce the ratio of consuming to attempting right now. If you have been spending 8 hours watching tutorials and 2 hours practicing, reverse it. 2 hours of input, 8 hours of genuine attempt. The attempts will feel messier and more frustrating than the watching. That is exactly the point. The mess is the learning. The friction is the brain building the pathways that the clean, comfortable watching never could." If you are ready to stop consuming and start constructing, type this below. I do. I learn. I improve. 2. The 80-20 rule of skill. Find the 20% that produces 80% of the results. Not all parts of a skill are equally important. This is one of the most consistently underappreciated truths about learning, and it is the reason why two people can spend the same amount of time on the same subject and end up at completely different levels of capability. One person learned everything in the curriculum. The other person learned the right things first. Every skill, regardless of how complex and intimidating it appears from the outside, has a small set of core components that produce the majority of the results. The fundamental techniques that everything else is built upon. The core vocabulary that unlocks the rest of the subject once it is genuinely owned. The basic movements that, mastered early and deeply, make every advanced movement accessible rather than mysterious. The foundational principles that, once understood at a genuine level rather than a surface level, make most of the complexity above them begin to resolve itself naturally. This is the 20%. And the person who identifies it and masters it before moving to anything else is operating with a significant advantage over the person who begins at the beginning of the curriculum and works through everything in the order it was presented by someone whose goal was completeness rather than speed. Because the curriculum was designed for comprehensiveness, not for rapid skill acquisition. Textbooks and courses cover everything because they do not know which parts will matter most to you specifically. They are written for the broadest possible audience, which means they are optimized for nobody in particular. But your learning does not have to be general. It can be targeted precisely at the core components that will give you the most functional capability in the shortest amount of genuine practice time. The way to find the 20% is deceptively simple. Find someone who is already genuinely skilled in what you are trying to learn and ask them this specific question. If you had to start over from the beginning, knowing everything you know now, what would you focus on first, and why? The answer to that question almost always reveals the 20%. The thing that every experienced practitioner wishes they had understood earlier. The component that, when genuinely mastered, makes everything else click into place rather than remaining isolated pieces of information. Master that first, deeply and completely before moving on. Let it give you the functional capability that makes the rest of the learning more efficient rather than trying to learn everything simultaneously and making frustratingly slow progress across the entire skill. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "If someone is able to show me that what I think or do is not right, I will happily change." The willingness to change your learning approach when a better one is available is itself one of the most important learning skills a person can develop. And the approach of identifying and deeply mastering the 20% first is consistently more efficient than the approach of working through everything in the order someone else decided it should be taught. 3. Struggle is not a sign that you are failing, it is the sign that you are learning. Josh Waitzkin writes in The Art of Learning about what he calls living in the discomfort zone. Not the comfort zone where everything is easy and familiar and the brain is not being asked to build anything new, and not the panic zone where the challenge is so far beyond current capability that nothing productive can happen. The discomfort zone, the precise space just beyond what you can currently do with ease. Where the challenge is genuine and the effort required is real and uncomfortable, and the outcome of each attempt is genuinely uncertain. That space, uncomfortable as it is to inhabit consistently, is where all meaningful learning actually happens. And most people spend almost no time there, because most people stop learning at the exact moment learning is most productive. The moment the material stops making immediate sense and requires real mental effort to penetrate. The moment the practice produces frustration rather than smooth and satisfying progress. The moment the genuine struggle arrives and the brain signals that this is hard. They stop not because they cannot continue, but because they have been conditioned by years of schooling and grading and performance evaluation to interpret difficulty as a signal that something is wrong. That they are not smart enough for this particular thing, that they are approaching it incorrectly and need to find a clearer explanation before continuing. That the struggle is evidence of inadequacy rather than evidence of genuine engagement with something worth learning. But the difficulty is not a signal that something is wrong. It is the most reliable signal available that something is right, that the brain is operating at the edge of its current capability, that the challenge is genuine, and therefore the growth it produces will also be genuine rather than the shallow familiarity that easy material produces. Waitzkin describes his own experience of this in the chess world, where he noticed that his greatest improvements came not from the games he won comfortably, but from the positions that were genuinely and sometimes painfully difficult, the ones that required extended and uncomfortable mental effort to penetrate, the ones where he did not immediately see the answer and had to struggle with the material for much longer than felt comfortable or productive. Those positions built something that the easy games and the comfortable practice sessions never could. Genuine depth of intuitive understanding rather than the surface pattern recognition that comfortable practice produces. Researchers who study how learning actually works call this desirable difficulty, the challenges that feel significantly harder in the moment, but produce dramatically better long-term retention and genuine capability compared to the easier approaches that feel more comfortable in the short term, but produce less lasting and less usable learning over time. The harder path through the material is almost always the more efficient path. Not more efficient in terms of how it feels while you are walking it, more efficient in terms of the actual capability built per hour of genuine engagement. The person who embraces the struggle, who deliberately positions themselves in the discomfort zone and stays there rather than retreating to familiar ground, is building genuine neural pathways through the resistance that the comfortable path never encounters. Epictetus said, "It is not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters." And the reaction to the struggle of learning is one of the most consequential choices available to a person trying to develop genuine skill. Interpret the struggle as failure and retreat to comfort, or interpret it as the most reliable signal that the learning is working and lean in deliberately. The first reaction produces slow learners who plateau early. The second produces fast learners who keep improving long after others have stopped. If you are ready to embrace the struggle as the actual mechanism of growth, claim this below. Struggle means I am growing. 4. Spaced repetition. The brain forgets on a predictable schedule, and you can use that schedule to learn permanently. Here is something the education system never taught you about how your own memory actually works. You forget things on a completely predictable schedule. Not randomly, not based on how important the information is or how much you want to remember it. On a curve that has been well understood for over a century and that most learners are working directly against rather than with. The forgetting curve shows that after learning something new, you forget roughly half of it within the first day if you do not review it, and then more of it over the following days, until the majority of what you learned has faded back into inaccessibility. This is not a flaw in your memory. It is a feature of a system designed to maintain only what it regularly needs to access. The brain does not maintain information it is never asked to retrieve. It gradually releases information that is not reinforced because maintaining unused information has a real metabolic cost. And the way to signal to the brain that specific information is worth maintaining is to retrieve it again before it completely fades, to access it at the specific intervals that communicate to the brain that this information is being used regularly and is therefore worth keeping readily accessible. This is spaced repetition. And it is one of the most powerful learning principles available because it works directly with the brain's natural forgetting and consolidation schedule rather than fighting against it. The way most people study works in the opposite direction entirely. They concentrate their review into a single intensive session. They read the chapter and then read it again and then read it a third time all in one sitting. And then they move on and never return to it until a test forces them to. This approach produces a strong initial feeling of familiarity that fades remarkably quickly because the brain received one strong concentrated signal rather than multiple spaced signals that communicate ongoing need for the information. The more effective approach is to review material at deliberately increasing intervals. Once shortly after the initial learning while it is still fresh, again a day later when some forgetting has occurred, again 3 days after that when the fading has continued, again a week after that, each review timed at the window where some forgetting has occurred but complete forgetting has not yet happened. That specific timing is what makes spaced repetition so powerful. Reviewing before any forgetting occurs is less effective because you are not actually practicing genuine retrieval from memory. You are simply recognizing information that is still fully available. Reviewing after complete forgetting has occurred means starting over from scratch as though the material was never learned. The window between partial forgetting and complete forgetting is where the retrieval effort produces the strongest signal to the brain that this information deserves to be kept. And using that window consistently changes not just how much you retain, but how deeply the information is encoded and how readily it is accessible when you actually need it. Marcus Aurelius returned to the same principles in his private journal every single morning of his adult life. Not because he had forgotten them, because he understood that ideas and values worth living by need to be regularly retrieved and renewed, rather than encountered once and assumed to be permanently absorbed and available. He was practicing spaced repetition on the principles of his own character. The same principle applies to any skill or knowledge you are trying to genuinely own rather than temporarily hold. 5. Teach what you learn. The best way to truly understand something is to be forced to explain it. There is a test that immediately and ruthlessly reveals the difference between thinking you understand something and actually understanding it. Try to explain it to someone who knows absolutely nothing about it, not using the technical vocabulary of the field that allows you to sound like you understand without having to demonstrate that understanding, not leaning on the jargon and the terminology and the specialized language that functions as a shortcut among people who are already familiar with the subject, in plain language, from first principles, in a way that a complete beginner with no background in the subject could genuinely follow and understand. If you can do that, you understand it. If you cannot, what you actually have is familiarity with the language of the subject rather than genuine understanding of the subject itself. And familiarity with language is not the same thing as understanding. It is one of the most convincing imposters available, because the language of a field feels like understanding from the inside, even when the genuine conceptual grasp is shallow or absent. This distinction matters enormously for learning speed, because it reveals where the real gaps are with a precision that no amount of rereading the material can match. Most people move through material accumulating familiarity with concepts without ever testing whether their understanding is genuine. They recognize the terms when they encounter them again. They can follow along with an explanation when someone else is giving it. They feel like they understand, because the concepts feel familiar and the language feels comfortable. But feeling familiar and genuinely understanding are built through completely different processes, and they produce completely different capabilities. The gap between them only becomes visible when you try to explain, when you attempt to generate the understanding rather than recognize it, to produce the explanation from your own genuine grasp rather than receive it from someone else's. That attempt at generation reveals every gap in the understanding immediately and with complete specificity. The place where the explanation breaks down, where the language runs out and the concepts stop connecting, is the precise place where the genuine understanding ends and the surface familiarity begins. And that specific location of breakdown is the most valuable learning information you can receive, because it tells you exactly where more work is needed, not a general sense that you should probably study more. The precise point where the genuine understanding is insufficient and needs to be rebuilt from a more solid foundation. The practice is simple. After learning something new, close the book or end the video and explain what you just learned out loud or in writing, as though you are teaching it to someone who has no background in the subject. Where the explanation flows clearly and completely, the understanding is genuine and can be relied on. Where it stumbles, where the words run out or the concepts fail to connect, the understanding needs work. Return to the material specifically at the point of the stumbling. Work with it until the explanation flows again, and then explain again to test whether the gap has genuinely been filled or only papered over with more surface familiarity. Seneca wrote, "Docendo discimus." By teaching, we learn. The teaching is not the reward you collect after you have finished learning. It is one of the primary mechanisms through which the genuine learning actually occurs. 6. Feedback is the fuel of fast learning. Without it, you are perfecting your mistakes. Josh Waitzkin describes in The Art of Learning what he calls investment in loss, the willingness to deliberately put yourself in situations where you will lose, where you will be visibly outperformed by someone more skilled, where your current limitations will be on full display rather than carefully concealed behind the privacy of solo practice. Specifically, because those are the situations where the most rapid and the most honest learning occurs. This is one of the most psychologically demanding aspects of genuinely fast learning, and it is one of the most consistently avoided. Because seeking feedback early, before you feel competent enough to not be embarrassed by what the feedback might reveal, requires the willingness to be seen at your worst, the willingness to show someone who knows more than you what you are currently doing, and to receive their honest and potentially uncomfortable assessment of it. Most people protect themselves from this by practicing privately until they feel confident enough to be observed, until the performance has improved enough that the exposure feels less threatening, until the gap between what they are doing and what they should be doing is small enough that the feedback will not be too painful to receive, and by the time they reach that point, the incorrect approach has been practiced hundreds or thousands of times. The wrong movement has been repeated until it feels natural. The ineffective pattern has been reinforced until it is the automatic response. The misconception has been built upon until an entire structure of understanding rests on a foundation that will need to be demolished before the correct version can be built. Because feedback is the mechanism through which practice becomes improvement rather than simply repetition of whatever you already do. Without honest external feedback, practice is just doing the same things repeatedly, and repeatedly doing something incorrectly, with no external correction, produces a highly practiced version of the incorrect approach, not competence. A confident and deeply ingrained incompetence that is significantly harder to correct than the beginner-level incompetence that existed before all that practice. Waitzkin's concept of investment in loss is about choosing the harder path deliberately, choosing to be in the room with people who are better than you, rather than practicing only with people who are at your level or below. Choosing the position where your weaknesses are fully visible, rather than the position where your strengths can be displayed and your weaknesses hidden. Because the room where your weaknesses are fully visible is the room where they get addressed. And the room where they get addressed is the room where the fastest and the most lasting learning happens. The practical application of this principle is to seek feedback before you feel ready for it. In the first sessions with a new skill, from someone who actually knows what correct looks like and can distinguish it from what you are currently doing, with the specific intention of finding what is wrong rather than confirming what is right, and then to use that feedback immediately rather than waiting for more practice to make the correction feel natural. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "If someone is able to show me that what I think or do is not right, I will happily change, for I seek the truth, by which no one was ever truly harmed." Seek the truth early, even when the truth is that what you are currently doing is not right, especially then, because early feedback is cheap to act on, late feedback is expensive, and the person who consistently seeks honest feedback early and acts on it immediately is learning at a completely different rate than the person who protects their ego by practicing privately until they feel ready to be seen. If you are ready to seek honest feedback and use it to accelerate your growth, write this below. I seek feedback. I improve faster. 7. The learning does not end when the session ends. Protect the hours after learning. Josh Waitzkin writes in The Art of Learning about a practice he calls the soft zone. The idea that peak performance and peak learning do not come from a state of grinding, rigid concentration that is maintained without interruption until the session is over, but from a quality of relaxed and alert awareness that is fully engaged without being tense, and that after a period of intense learning, the brain needs to transition through exactly that kind of soft zone before being subjected to the next wave of demanding and competing input. Because learning does not end when the studying ends. The brain continues processing and consolidating new information for a significant period after the active learning session has finished. Neural connections are being strengthened. New information is being integrated with existing knowledge structures. The patterns that will make new information retrievable in the future are being established and reinforced, and this consolidation process is surprisingly vulnerable to interference from new demanding information that arrives too quickly after the learning session. When new and competing input arrives immediately after a learning session, the brain is forced to shift its limited processing resources toward the incoming information. The consolidation of what was just learned is interrupted before it can complete. The strengthening of the new neural pathways is cut short, and the result is significantly poorer retention of the material from that session than would have occurred if the period after learning had been protected from new competing demands. Waitzkin describes this principle in the context of his competitive preparation, where he discovered that the recovery periods between intense training sessions were not empty time to be filled with other productive activity. They were an essential part of the training itself. The time during which the brain was doing the integration and consolidation work that made the next training session build on a more solid foundation than it would have if the consolidation had been interrupted. Not passive, essential. The practical application of this principle is simpler than most people expect and more effective than most people believe. Protect the period after a focused learning session from new demanding cognitive input, not by doing nothing necessarily, by doing something that does not compete with the consolidation process, something physical, a walk. Light activity that engages the body without demanding the kind of focused cognitive processing that competes with the brain's ongoing consolidation work. Something low demand that allows the mental process that started during the learning session to continue undisturbed toward completion. This single adjustment to what happens in the hour after learning rather than during it consistently improves retention in ways that feel almost disproportionate to how simple the change actually is. The learning itself did not change. The interference with the consolidation of the learning was reduced, and that reduction in interference produced meaningfully better retention of the same material from the same amount of study time. Epictetus said, "First say to yourself what you would be, and then do what you have to do." And what you would be is the kind of learner who retains what they learn, rather than the kind who studies consistently and forgets almost as consistently. Protecting the consolidation period after each learning session is one of the most direct and most immediately available steps toward becoming that kind of learner. It requires no additional time investment. It requires only a change in what you do with the time that was already there. Nobody taught you how to learn, but now you know, and knowing changes everything, because the gap between the person who learns the fast way and the person who learned the slow way, because nobody taught them differently, is not a gap of intelligence. It is not a gap of talent or dedication or the number of hours available in the day. It is a gap of method, and method is entirely learnable by anyone willing to apply it. 7 principles. Stop consuming and start constructing, because the brain builds genuine capability through doing, not through watching. Find